Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. It's called Thinking Outside of the Donation Box. Uh, whoops. Looking beyond the charity model of addressing food insecurity in Canada. And we're really excited to be presenting this today. My name is Marianne Martin, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Trent University in the School of the Environment. And I'm working with Michael Classens, who's here, and I think might show himself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael Clastens. I'm a professor, assistant professor in the Trent School of Environment, Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems program at Trent University.
And our work has been supported through the COVID-19 project, funding that was made available through the Trent Research Office, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Grow Change, which is an initiative of the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems program at the Trent School of the Environment. And Grow Change focuses on ensuring long-term food security and the health of our environment and our communities through regenerative agriculture and local food processes. Before we move on, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional lands on which we reside. Trent University and my community of Clarington are both located on the treaty and the traditional territory of the Michi Sagig Anishinaabeg, and we offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care and their teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings and go forward to actively live in harmony with them. Before we kick off, I would just like to do a few housekeeping things. First, I want to let everybody know that this event is being recorded and it will be sent out to everybody who registered or tried to register, and it'll also be posted on the Grow Change website. And I'm pleased to tell you that the discussion today is also being live illustrated by Jason Wilkins from Wilkins Art and Creative. Jason is a passionate local illustrator and muralist who has been doing this work for about 20 years. He's based in and has helped to beautify and animate the community of Peterborough, Ontario. So the webinar is going to start with just a little bit of background. Then we've got two presentations from our expert speakers. We'll follow them with some prepared questions, a check-in with Jason, and then we're going to open the floor up to questions and answers from all of you. So you can ask questions at any point. Feel free to use the Q&A function on your screen. But also, if you want to make comments or talk amongst yourselves in the chat box, please go ahead. This webinar emerged from discussions with members of Peterborough's Food Access for Vulnerable Populations Network, and in particular, a discussion about the ongoing dominance, especially during the December holiday season, of food charity. The Food Access Group developed in March, just after the global pandemic was declared, to bring organizations and community advocates together who are concerned about food access for vulnerable populations. The hope is to better understand current concerns, needs, and resources. The Food Access Group is just one example of today's heightened emphasis on emergency food as organizations try to respond to unprecedented levels of food insecurity, as government directs resources to food charity, and as we enter this holiday season. Recent reports from Ontario Dietitians for Public Health, the Toronto Foundation, Feed Ontario, Food Banks Canada, and others all assert that food insecurity is a serious and worsening problem, and that food charity fails to address it. I'm delighted to have our speakers here today to provide us with some insight from their expertise into this issue. Our first speaker is Dr. Elaine Power. She's a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies and head of gender studies at Queen's University. Her research lies at the intersection of food studies and public health sociology. Elaine is a passionate advocate of a basic income to eliminate poverty, the root cause of food insecurity and hunger. She believes that the disappearance of food banks would be a strong indicator of an effective anti-poverty strategy. Elaine is co-author with Kingston social justice activist Jamie Swift of the forthcoming book, The Case for Basic Income, Freedom, Security, and Justice, and that will be coming out in May of 2021. It features stories of participants in the prematurely cancelled Ontario Basic Income pilot, and I can hardly wait to read it. Our second speaker is Dr. Rod MacRae. He's a food policy analyst with 35 years of experience examining the transition to sustainable and health promoting food system for Canada. Following doctoral studies at McGill University, he coordinated the Toronto Food Policy Council for 10 years, helping to establish it as one of North America's leading municipal food policy agencies. He then worked for 10 years as a consultant to governments, businesses, and NGOs on projects to advance sustainable food systems in Canada. He's currently an associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University and continues to consult on food system matters and contributes regularly to media coverage of food issues. With more than 150 publications, his analysis is frequently used to design policies, programs, and NGO and business strategies. His approach to food systems change is widely applied in many organizations that employ the 100 graduate students whose degrees have been completed under his supervision. Dr. MacRae's recent research focus is the design and implementation of a national joined-up food policy for Canada. And you can find out more about that at foodpolicyforcanada.info.yorku.ca. And I think maybe we can post that on the chat box. So I'm delighted to have you here, both of you. And I'm going to start by turning it over to Dr. Elaine Power.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see, here we go. I really appreciate you organizing this today, and thank you to you and to Michael, and I'm happy to share the webinar with Rod today. I'm sorry we can't gather in person, but I guess there are some advantages of Zoom in that people can join who wouldn't otherwise be able to be here. So thank you all for coming, and I hope everybody's warm on this chilly day. It's really cold in Kingston, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and it's in the dish with one spoon territory. So I'm going to kick it off by talking about food insecurity. And I'm going to start with my dream, because I think we forget to dream. We've been forgetting to dream. And I think we need to dream of what we want in order to set our goal, our intention of where we want to be. And so for me, my dream is that Canada, we live in a Canada where we value the common humanity of everyone and ensure that everyone has what they need to live a socially acceptable life and provide the social, material, educational, and political conditions in which everyone has opportunities to flourish and become the best version of themselves. And my dream and my presentation comes out of more than 25 years of thinking about food insecurity in Canada. Probably with this audience, I don't need to spend too much time on this. The latest data from the Canadian Community Health Survey showed that almost 13% of Canadian households were food insecure. 1 in 8 Canadians, that's about 4.4 million, and 1.2 million children. And you can see from the map, this is data from Proof from the University of Toronto Val-Terrasex group that shows, incredibly high rates of food insecurity in some places, especially in the north and especially on the East Coast. And we know that food insecurity has profound health effects, multiple health problems from, mental, physical, dental, any kind of chronic condition. We also know that healthcare costs increase stepwise as food insecurity worsens. And in fact, even that the risk of premature death increases as food insecurity worsens. If we look at mental health, we see that children and youth have higher rates of depression. They have higher rates of thinking about suicide and suicide attempts into adulthood. We know that we've seen that there's strong association between maternal depression and food insecurity, which isn't that surprising when you think about what it means to live in a food insecure household. And we also know that the most severe form of food insecurity is also associated with persistent poverty and intimate partner violence. We know very clearly that food insecurity is a problem of poverty, that the risk of food insecurity rises dramatically as household income levels drop. And we know that some groups, the same groups that are disproportionately poor, are also disproportionately more likely to be food insecure. And that includes Black and Indigenous people, people with children, especially single mothers, new immigrants, people on social assistance or other government supports, people working precarious minimum wage gig economy jobs, and people who rent their homes. So it's also not surprising that in COVID that we saw, at least we only have one measure, and it's not the same survey or the same sample as the Canadian Community Health Survey, so we can't directly compare, but we can be assured that food insecurity has increased in the pandemic. We know that lots of people have been struggling, and I think we're still learning the effects of that, and things unfortunately could be a really bad winter. I think as the CERB, it looks like even though the government acted really quickly with CERB and probably kept a lot more people from sinking into poverty and bankruptcy, you know, the conditions are such now that some people are going to have to pay tax on CERB. There are people who got it who now suddenly are no longer eligible. Banks have stopped their mortgage. There was a 6-month moratorium on mortgage payments that's ending. So things could unfortunately looks like they could be getting worse before they get better. And what do we have as a response? Our major response is food charity and food banks. So we have the Prime Minister telling us back in October, if we were heading to the grocery store to pick up things for Thanksgiving dinner, to put a few extra things in the food bank bin, that's the Canadian way, which is outrageous to me. I think the Canadian way is a different way, but we'll get to that. We've had almost 40 years now of food banks. The first one opened in 1981 back in Edmonton, and they spread quickly across the country in the 80s. By the 90s, they'd become institutionalized, and we sometimes forget that they were initially intended as a stopgap measure, temporary. Instead, food banks have purchased buildings, and it's become kind of almost a part of the fabric of our social life to, bring a donation to the food bank. We know really clearly that they're ineffective in addressing food insecurity. Most people who are food insecure never go to the food bank, approximately 3 out of 4. And that's for a whole variety of reasons. And over, if you talk to people who are food insecure, they'll say, someone else is worse off than I am, and I'm going to leave the food for them. It's, I'm not that bad off. So there's issues of dignity, there's issues of stigma, there's issues related to health and cultural concerns that the food isn't appropriate. Some people don't live in neighborhoods that have a food bank accessible. The hours sometimes are not conducive for people to pick things up. So there's a lot of reasons. Even the people who do actually get there and get to the food bank, they're still food insecure. So the only solution we've seen that is actually effective is income. And the best that food banks can do is enable some people who are hungry to be less hungry. So it kind of begs the question of why we still have them. 40 years later, we're still doing the same thing, and things certainly are not getting better, and by some measures are getting worse. And we also have this insane situation where our governments are giving food banks millions of dollars during the pandemic. I think one of the reasons is that food banks for a long time now have been set up to make the donors feel good. And this was from 2 years ago, actually, at my local LCBO, where an Ontario winery was giving a portion of the sales of a bottle of wine to Ontario Association of Food Banks, and in doing, and you'll notice the name of the wine, Good Karma. So food banks have become a way in which we demonstrate that we're good citizens. Right from kindergarten, kids learn that the good thing to do, especially at this time of year, is to bring food to give to the school food drive. And then on it goes from kindergarten. It's, as I say, become a feature of our social life. As early as 1994, anthropologist Laura DeLinde from the United States was noticing this idea that donating to food banks was something to celebrate. And this is from a few years ago now, the Purelator Tackle Hunger Happy 50th anniversary. Lots of celebration of donation, which we also see in the CBC Sounds of the Season campaign, which is on now. Purelator used to have a week to tackle hunger, but apparently that wasn't enough. So now they have a month. And again, we have this idea that this is what Canada is all about. Every day we see Canadians reaching out to help one another, and that is an important part of what it means to be Canadian. And I think that's true, that Canadians do want to help each other and we do want to support each other, but we're not very good at recognizing that food banks are actually getting in the way of that, of what I think we would like to be able to do. I think food banks embody some, I would call them misguided ideas about what Christian, quote unquote, Christian charity means. What we see lots in the food bank food drives, we see things, helping the poor, serving others, doing good. And this way of organizing charity actually reinforces hierarchy and helps the donors feel good about themselves. So we have this idea of the moral superiority, often associated with, white middle-class Christian people, which I think actually reinforces the divisions between us and them, and relies on a sense of pity for people who are living on low incomes. I think corporate interests have actually taken that idea of that, this is what Canadians do, and used it, and it plays on our desire to help each other and support each other. And they do that to preserve the status quo because they don't want to see increased taxes, for example, that would boost our efforts at actually doing effective poverty reduction. And I think Rod will probably have more to say about corporate interests in the food system. And really, there's no motivation for government to change this. It really lets them off the hook from doing anything effective. I've been thinking a lot about the roots of the word charity, which it's from the Latin caritas, which also translates as a agape, or kind of love, known as the highest form of love, and that's more concerned with ensuring the greatest good for everyone. And I think it's kind of analogous to compassion, which is not just understanding or sharing the feelings of other, but actually incorporates the desire to alleviate the sufferings of other. And so I think that's very much aligned with the public health idea of thinking upstream and addressing upstream problems and addressing the roots of the issue. So I think from the perspective of agape, charity would eliminate the distinction between us and them and ensure that the golden rule was actually in play, that we would do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And for me, this is very much the foundation of a basic income or guaranteed income. This is from a few years ago, the former director of Policy and Research at Food Banks Canada, saying that a guaranteed income, also known as basic income, we can get into the terminology if people want, but that this could end the need for food banks. And I applaud Sean for saying that. I don't know if this is part of the reason he's no longer at Food Banks Canada. I'm not sure. Ontario did have a basic income pilot, short-lived. It was announced by the former Premier Kathleen Wynne in the 2016 budget, came into play in 2017. and then was prematurely canceled by the Ford government. That's Lisa McLeod there with the sign that says "Live in Poverty," which the whole sign said 1 in 8 Ontarians live in poverty. But some of us think this photo captures the real essence of what she was trying to do when she canceled the pilot. Unfortunately, if the Ford government did as it had promised during the election campaign and let the pilot run, we would have data now to inform our current debate about whether CERB should be turned into a basic income. So it's really unfortunate. They canceled the pilot before any data other than the baseline data could be gathered. What we do know from some convenient samples of participants is that the people who were 4,000 Ontarians who were in the basic income pilot experienced transformative effects in their lives. We have 2 studies of convenient samples, so it's not the kind of rigorous research that we would have gotten if the pilot had been allowed to run. But we know from Hamilton that we see from both these studies that lots of people had profound and important impacts on their food insecurity. So almost half of the people who signed up were severely food insecure, meaning that they were skipping meals at least once a day and sometimes longer. And most of the people who participated actually had improved food security. They were eating more fruits and vegetables. They had a better diet quality. Many were able to stop using the food bank. So this adds to the body of literature that suggests that Ontario, a basic income would improve people's food purchasing and their diet. If anyone wants to follow up on that, there's actually both of these studies, although they are convenient samples, are pretty powerful and profound in terms of the impacts that people reported. Our Prime Minister is, as recently as the 3rd of December, said he doesn't see any path for basic income right now. So even though there's quite a lot of support among Liberals and in the general public, he's not picking that up at this point. There's 2 main objections to basic income. The first is that we can't afford it. And the second is it will make people lazy. And it doesn't seem to matter how much evidence we can marshal to the contrary. People don't seem to want to take that in. Just before the pandemic struck, Basic Income Canada Network put out a policy options paper that showed that we could take the existing pool of tax money and redistribute it and ensure that all Canadians had a minimum income of $22,000 per year for a single person without raising taxes. It would mean that the people in the bottom half of the income distribution would get money back from the income tax system, and those of us who are in the top half would pay more. Some of us would pay a lot more. The we can't afford it argument ignores the cost of poverty, the high cost that we're already paying in healthcare, in education, in the justice system. The human suffering really is incalculable in terms of monetary, kind of adding it up in terms of the monetary aspect. And people are literally dying in poverty in this country. We don't, that doesn't end up on the death certificate, but we know really clearly from the social determinants of health literature that people die prematurely. I've actually been doing some interviews with people who weren't eligible for CERB for whatever reason. And I asked them about what they would say to people who thinks that basic income would make them lazy. So this is a quote from Tim, who's a homeless man living in Kenora. And he, as many others who were homeless in Kenora who participated in the study, said they don't even have a chance to be lazy. He says, I got to carry around my bag. I'm kind of sleepwalking from place to place. People that think it'll make us lazy, I would say, try to come down here. And he says, Kenora is not as bad as some places, but it's pretty rough. Even coming down for a couple of hours a day for a week would probably be too much. I don't think it would make us lazy. I think it would make us grateful. And this is a quote from a young woman who was on medical leave. And when she came back to her job after the pandemic had started, it had disappeared. So she's working at a fast food restaurant. She has type 1 diabetes. She says it would motivate them to do more things. It would motivate them to do more of a job that they enjoy instead of 2 or 3 jobs and putting themselves into a medical situation that they shouldn't have to push themselves into. Maybe even $2,000 a month would help them put away just a little bit so that they could actually get further into that field and make a little bit more and make as much as they need, but doing something that they love. So what she's saying is that, you know, people would have more choice about the kind of what they did with their time and the kind of work that they engaged in, and would have the security and the stability to take their time to find the job that they really love. And she was trying to save up some money to go to college, was finding it very challenging. She and her 2 roommates were paying oh my gosh, I've forgotten, some outrageous amount of money for a basement apartment in Langley. So the interviews have reminded me that the interviews I've been doing with people living in poverty who didn't qualify for CERB remind me of Frederick Ingalls' idea of social murder, that when we keep people deprived of the necessities of life, that they meet an early premature death. And he says that surely death by violence, as that by the sword or the bullet, even if you can't see the murderer. I've also called it a form of state-inflicted violence. And now we have, you know, CBC promoting its Sounds of the Season. I would ask if you're inclined to support that, and even if you're not, to please do something to not just charity, but to act for justice. And conveniently, the Ontario Dietitians in Public Health have put together a nice template letter that you can use, you can download and then personalize to send to your political leaders. They've organized it all very nicely. There's also lots more information at the various basic income networks, the Basic Income Canada Network, Ontario Basic Income Network, Coalition Canada Basic Income. There's also a number of cases now for basic income, including the case for basic income for the arts and a case for basic income for food security, which is available on the Open website if you'd like to sign it. And I think that's it for me. Stop share. There we go. Maybe we could put the Open, the letter, the URL in the chat as well if people want to sign it.
Great. Thanks, Elaine. That was amazing. Thank you so much for telling us about the pervasiveness and the impacts of food insecurity, and sort of breaking down how we as a society have dealt with it and continue to deal with it, you know, these 40 years later, you know, and sort of deconstructing what it means to participate in charity food giving and where that's coming from. So thank you so much. And some of the things that we can do.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I'm trying to stay calm because some of these things really enrage me. And so I'm trying to stay calm and not burst into flames. But thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to the questions.
Yeah, lots of deep breathing going on there. There was one comment in the chat that I just wanted to address. Shirley wrote in as you were speaking about the demographics of people affected by food insecurity, and wanted to note that the rates are much higher in First Nations communities, averaging about 50%. And whether you're able to speak to that. At this time, we did a recent food security survey in 2 First Nation communities that showed 100% moderate and severe food security. So just if you have a point or two about the levels of food insecurity among Indigenous people.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. The research, so the Canadian Community Health Survey doesn't include reserves and remote Indigenous communities. And there's all kinds of, I don't claim to understand the politics of that. But the urban Indigenous people have generally between 2.5 to 3 times the rate of the average household for food insecurity. And the research that has been done for especially the remote communities is staggering. You know, it's a national disgrace. It's really just appalling. So yes, thank you for that point.
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks, Shirley, for bringing up that point. Now we're going to turn it to Dr. Rod MacRae to speak a bit more about policy and how policy affects and is affected by food charity.
Thanks, Marianne. I'll just organize my screen here. So I'll continue by looking at the food system itself, the food system and the way it's structured, especially as it relates to food acquisition, food retail, is a big part of the story as well. Income is obviously the most significant part. It's a huge piece. And I guess one way to think of it would be to say, even if everybody had more income associated, say, with a basic income, would that solve all the problems of food insecurity in Canada? And it would not, I don't think. It would obviously be a big improvement. And some of the related challenges are because of the way the food system itself is structured. So a few core thoughts that inform the way I think about this. The first is that, of course, food, air, and water are the 3 biological requirements of life for most organisms, including us, humans. And really only food is treated primarily as a private sector system. In other words, for air and water, we don't have to reach into our purses and wallets to breathe and drink. I mean, we do sometimes, but mostly we don't have to. But for most of us who no longer can self-provision, you have to reach in and grab some money in order to eat. So it begs the question, why would we have a food system if it isn't to ensure everyone has access to a nourishing, affordable diet? What is the purpose of a food system if it doesn't deliver on that fundamental objective? And of course, because in Canada we have publicly funded healthcare, it means we're all paying for each other's diseases and conditions associated with poor diets. So we have an even greater incentive trying to reduce our healthcare costs to ensure that everybody has access to a nourishing, affordable diet. Now, that's not what we have right now. And our colleagues at the Ryerson Center for Studies in Food Securities have basically said, well, if we had a really well-functioning food system, it would guarantee what they call the 5 A's. It would make sure that there was enough food available, that it was accessible. In other words, it was effectively distributed, that it would be culturally acceptable and nutritionally adequate, ecologically sustainable and safe. And the 5th A, which is in many ways the most important one, is it would enable individuals and households and communities to take action to easily acquire the diet that made sense for them. Again, that's not what we've got in the Canadian food system. Elaine spoke eloquently to some of these things, so I'll skip over this. And the problem, in a way, is that the dominant rules of the food system are antithetical to what we're talking about. The system is really designed around high productivity and high levels of input, high volumes, scale efficiency, low cost production, but low cost in a particular way that's actually perverse, in that it often also means low quality. The focus is on shareholder value and dominating markets, on centralizing production and processing, and then moving food around. So one estimate is that the average food molecule in Canada travels 4,000 kilometers, because essentially Canada has an import-export food economy. We're the 5th largest exporter in the world of food, and we're the 5th largest importer. In fact, our rate of increase in imports is greater than our rate of increase in exports. So if that trend continued over a number of years, we'd actually be what's called a food debtor nation, which puts a lie to the idea that Canada is one of the bread baskets to the world. we have this concept in the food system of value added, but what that really means is extracting money from consumers and homogenizing taste rather than, say, nutritional value added. And a lot of the things, a lot of the problems of the system are externalized costs. In other words, the producers of the food are not actually paying for them. They get offloaded to others, and they get reflected in our health problems and environmental problems. And the things that we might think are valuable, like access and quality and health and organic sustainability, these things are tolerated as long as they remain niches. If they get too big, then the dominant system tries to attack them and discourage their expansion. So let me spend just a few minutes talking about what's happening on the retail side. I'll just show a couple of graphs that give some longer term trend lines. So you can see from this one that the number of stores, food stores, these are the large supermarkets. The number of stores is actually declining, going back to 1990, and the average sales per store is increasing. So we've got larger and larger stores, which means, of course, they tend to be more distanced, and I'll show you some maps on that in a few moments. And so this has an impact, obviously, on the number of stores that are actually accessible to various groups of people in the country. Oops, something happened there. So another part of this trend line is that in most parts of the country, it's the chain stores that have the largest part of the marketplace. So you can see, looking at the different regions in Canada, that only Quebec has a circumstance where the independents, the smaller chains, the independents, the smaller operations have a larger percentage of the marketplace. And this is significant because, of course, the chain stores tend to be dominated by rules that are set centrally, whereas the independents are more likely to do things that cater to local community needs. And what we now have is a situation where we have what's called the most corporately concentrated food economy in the Western world, and it's particularly acute in food retail, where we now have probably 4 firms controlling 70 to 80% of all food retailing in this country. And economists believe that when you have 4 firms controlling 40% of a marketplace, you have a very concentrated industry with negative impacts on both suppliers, farmers, and food manufacturers, and also negative impacts on consumers. Well, we've got 4 controlling 70 to 80%, and it got worse since this chart was done in the 2000s, because Sobeys bought Safeway Canada, Walmart has expanded its food offerings, Loblaws bought Shoppers Drug Mart, Metro bought Jean Coutu in Quebec. And so really now what we're seeing is this crossover phenomenon where we buy food in grocery stores and we buy we buy food in pharmacies and pharmacy goods in grocery stores. And this is because of this crossover. And one of the reasons why the large retailers have done this is because they realized they couldn't keep buying each other up without contravening the competition rules in this country and triggering a significant investigation by the federal government. So instead, they bought sort of parallel firms that do related things, and then they're cross-selling each other's goods. And where we buy food has shifted. This one looks at 1999 and 2011, and it's shifted again since 2011. But what's sort of critical about this is that we are buying more now from these general merchandise stores like Costco and Walmart, buying less from the chains, which is partly making the chains a bit desperate, and buying even more now from drugstores than would appear at this chart, because those purchases I was just mentioning have happened since 2011. And the other thing that's significant about this table is that it suggests that really a lot of the alternative ways to access food are a very small percentage of the total retail scene. This suggests that it's only about 1% of the ways in which we acquire foods is through alternative channels, and I'll speak to that a little bit more later. And this question of income is super critical for understanding how much people are spending on food. So even though the overall average for Canadians is low, we're actually only spending about 10% of our food expenditure, of our household expenditures as food, which is a super low level. It's one of the lowest in the world. When you break it down by income quintile, the story looks decidedly different. So if you're in the lowest 20%, Canada is in the red on this chart. If you're in the lowest 20%, then you're paying more like 15%. And if you're in the really low income category, the number is probably more like 30 to 40% of your household income is devoted to food. And we know from surveys across the country that social assistance rates are rarely sufficient for even covering the basics of food. And so as a result, people are forced to scrimp on food and pay for other expenditures that are less flexible in the budget, housing being a big example. And the food price trends are also going in the wrong direction. Going back to 1980, food is the blue line, and also there are other items in here as well. All the lines are the same kind of trends. Excuse me, but the food prices have been going up significantly since this corporate concentration that I've been talking about. One of the consequences of it is that it tends to make prices for consumers go up. In other words, as you have fewer choices, as the marketplace shrinks, as competition shrinks, there are frequently circumstances where firms can basically charge more knowing that you don't have an option about where else you're going to shop. And the same problem occurs for suppliers. If they don't have a range of firms to sell to, then they often end up in a situation where they have to take whatever price is offered to them. So corporate concentration is having a big impact on food prices, we believe. Although, as I say down below, when looking at things that depress food prices, the Walmart and Costco phenomena is significant because it's forced some of the chains to decide that at least for some of their food banners, they have to keep prices low in order to keep shoppers from running off to Walmart and Costco. Another big contributor to food price increases is supply chain disruption. So things like bad weather, strikes, political disputes, and of course, most recently, COVID, all these things are having an impact on the way supply chains function, and these disruptions typically will drive up prices. Our exchange rates actually have a big impact because we import so much food, particularly perishables. We're big importers of fruits and vegetables, mostly from the United States. So the exchange rate with the United States can often have a big impact on what we end up paying for food. Inflation, of course, and as we know, the Bank of Canada likes a certain level of inflation. They somehow think this is good for the economy. So that means, of course, that prices are going to be consistently going up. And then, of course, certain kinds of inputs into the way in which we produce, process, and distribute food will also affect prices, including the wage bill, because actually the average dollar you spend in a grocery store, about 30% of that goes to paying all the people who handle the food between the farm and your mouth. So by some estimates, the average food item in Canada is changing hands 30 times. And so that means every time somebody handles it, somebody has to get paid. So the wage bill is a significant factor. In contrast, what drives down prices, and these aren't necessarily good things, but they often will have the impact of reducing prices, is when we've got too much supply, and farmers usually suffer as a result when the supply gluts happen. Cheap imports, as I mentioned, we're the 5th largest importer of food in the world. So imports are significant. The Walmart and Costco effect, technological and logistical innovations will sometimes drive down costs because the system runs on volume and scale efficiency. So if you can reduce your costs per unit of production, then of course you have the possibility of reducing your prices. And then of course, in-store price manipulations. There are all kinds of reasons why stores will lower prices basically to get you into the store. They're called loss leaders. And the problem is they keep changing from week to week. So if you actually want to take advantage of those things, that's why you've got to follow the flyers or the prices on the internet and run around from store to store, which then typically increases your transportation costs. So you might be getting a better deal by following the loss leaders, but then you're paying more in your transportation. Now, I mentioned this question of access. Marina Carollo, who worked with me for a few years, one of my grad students, has done some interesting mapping of Toronto. And this one maps two things. The yellow dots are the public markets. So Toronto has over 100 different kinds of public markets. It's interesting in and of itself. I never realized until she'd done this work that we had that many. So the yellow dots are public markets, and they typically cater to middle and upper income earners, but also there are a number of different kinds of public markets that focus on low income communities. But when you look at the map, and the blue dots are chain store retail. So when you look at the map, you can see that there's major gaps in coverage. And this is a phenomenon that exists across North America. It's more acute probably in the United States than it is in Canada, but a lot of cities in Canada suffer from what's sometimes called the food desert phenomena. In other words, you have significant populations, typically low income and racialized communities, that can't get physical access to an affordable grocery store in any kind of a handy way. The transit system doesn't necessarily work that well. We know that there's reduced car ownership and mobility for a lot of low income people. All these factors will contribute to the food desert phenomena. And when you map where a lot of these places are, you can see it visually, the kind of gaps that exist in the system. So access is compromised by location of supermarkets. And of course, supermarkets get to choose where they go. I mean, within the broad planning frameworks of cities, it's really up to private firms to decide where they locate. These are not public decisions. These are private sector decisions. So it begs the question, do retailers really care about low-income shoppers? And you could say for a few banners, yes, because obviously the big chains all have a few banners that tend to focus on low-income shoppers. But largely the answer is no. And what often comes with a lower price is lower quality, especially for perishables. That's the trade-off that a lot of these stores set up. You can go to one of our low-income banners, but for example, the fruit and vegetable quality will be lower. The products might last very long. If you don't eat them right away, they go bad in your fridge. You have to go back to the store and buy more. It's not really obvious that you've generated any savings from shopping there in the first place. So really what they do is they sell mostly to middle and upper income earners. They sell to low-income people as an artifact, if you will, of selling to middle and upper income earners. There's a misplaced understanding too in the retail environment about community purchasing power. In other words, a lot of low-income neighborhoods actually have higher aggregate purchasing power than middle and upper income neighborhoods do because the density is so much higher. So even though each individual shopper may not have the same amount of money, when you look at the aggregate power, purchasing power of that community, it's actually larger than it will be in a wealthier community. And stores don't often align with core demographics, especially if they expect car traffic. So a lot of the stores operate on a model that assumes that a certain percentage of the customers will come from within, say, a kilometer, and they might actually then be able to walk to the store if they don't have any mobility challenges. But they also assume that significant percentages come from more than a mile away, which probably means they're going. So all that suggests that they don't necessarily have to align in a place that will be suitable for the demographic that is the closest to the store, which creates all kinds of access challenges. And also, they often don't carry culturally appropriate foods given the demographics of the neighborhood. And a lot of the lowest price marketing that we see, when we watch TV ads, there's all kinds of food stores saying the middle class than they are to low income shoppers, which again suggests that they don't really care that much about low income shoppers. Now, the good news in terms of advocacy is that retailers are also highly vulnerable, even though they're so economically powerful, that comes with kind of corporate concentration. They're actually vulnerable to certain kinds of things because they have very narrow profit margins per item. So that means they're very dependent on volume. They come into the stores buying a lot of items in order to make any money. And we know that store loyalty is declining in a lot of areas with options. So people will shop in different. That's a bit closer to the farmer's market because they're tired of the big box operations and the kind of alienating experience it can be to go through a grocery store. And there's pressure for more product lines, making central warehousing and distribution more complex. There's competition, as I mentioned, from these low-cost outlets. And there's this growing rebellion, and it's gotten even larger during COVID. There's this rebellion against global. As I said, if food travels 4,000 kilometers and we're the 5th largest importer in the world, then we're buying a lot of food from a lot of different regions of the globe, and people are tired of that. They want to know where their food comes from. So all these things are making the retailers more vulnerable if we can design our advocacy strategies the right ways. So just a few things on solutions before I wrap up. And really where we want to go is we want to create a sustainable and health promoting food system. I view 10 really important goals, and it builds on the Ryerson 5As that I mentioned off the top. So we want to be really focused on adequacy and appropriateness, dependability, the sustainability system, safety, obviously. We also want to be very resource efficient, but we also need to pay particular attention to a lot of the equity issues. We want a food system that generates wealth equitably, both for the people who benefit from it and the people who are working in the system. It needs to be flexible. It needs to be respect different kinds of cultural requirements. We want it to allow for greater levels of participation, so it isn't just the large economic actors that are determining the shape of the system. It should be about human development and fulfillment, getting back to Elaine's comments about her dream. And of course, we also want to design our food system in a way that it doesn't compromise the food system of other nations. Now, obviously, this is challenging, and particularly when you're looking at policy change, it's easy to feel like it's not very tangible. It's easy to feel like it's all kind of abstract, and how are we going to make any progress on this? It seems like so big and so complex, and it is complex. So I find it's really important to think about the change process using a transition framework. And I use one, there are many of them out there, but I use one called the Efficiency Substitution Redesign Framework. And it's basically a way of categorizing solutions so we can move progressively towards redesign of the food system. And in the early stages, the efficiency stages, it means that we're looking at strategies that are relatively quick to implement and don't require a lot of resources. At the substitution stage, it's more time consuming, more resources are required, there's going to be more opposition to them. But if we design the efficiency stage correctly, then we create more momentum for moving into the substitution stage. And then at the redesign stage, that's when we're looking at really substantial redesign of the system to meet these particular goals that I'm talking about. So if we apply that thinking to some of the solutions that are potentially out there to improve food access, it could look something like this. So as I say, the municipal planning system is actually a big part of our problem. And to move to a better approach to planning, we have to actually start placing size restrictions on grocery stores. And municipalities actually do have the authority to do that. They don't exercise it for a variety of reasons, but they do have the ability to restrict size locations, restrict sizes, and also to shift locations. And part of the way they do that is they can eliminate these things called covenants. A lot of grocery stores, when they abandon a particular property, they get a covenant put on the land so that another grocery store can't be located there. So if you eliminate their ability to do that, legally eliminate it, then we have a greater opportunity to use more appropriate sites for grocery stores. We also could get the provincial government to change the community benefits provisions of the Planning Act. It's, for those of you who are planners, it's called Section 37. And these are benefits that typically don't include food retail, because a lot of the actors don't really think again of food as an important service, public service provided by municipal government. So if we change the provisions around benefits, we have more opportunities for grocery stores to be more equitably dispersed across the landscape and often attached to new neighborhoods and new developments. We would also need better grant programming for a lot of the alternative projects that are out there. We know that there are all kinds of super interesting NGO projects that are beneficial to relatively small groups of people because they're not scaled up and out sufficiently to really have facilitate that scaling up and out process. We also need to change the Competition Act. We have this federal legislation called the Competition Act and a Competition Bureau that is responsible for implementing. In Canada is we have very weak competition laws, and that's why we have these high levels of corporate concentration. So until we change the Competition Act, we're not going to be able to really control these high levels of economic power that food retailers have. So those things are all feasible within the first stage of transition. In the second stage, the substitution stage, we'd be looking at things like integrating food into public spaces, including expanding the market city idea. So Marina Carollo, who I mentioned earlier, I'll just show you her map. It's a little bit small, but basically she mapped out what would it look like if Toronto was a market city, where it said, we want to have every resident in the city in 15 minutes of a public market. And that's the bottom map with all the dots on it. That's what it would have to look like. What it looks like right now is this, obviously spaces across the city. So we have the capacity and the knowledge to actually expand public markets. It's a challenge, obviously, to the retail system, and they will fight it, which is why it's really more of a substitution strategy. But all these things are potentially feasible in the medium term. It requires significant changes from the municipality, the way it does things. And Marina has detailed that in some of her reports. Another key thing is that food retail is seen by planners as an essential service. In the same way that education and green space and other things are seen as essential services for neighborhoods, so must food retail be considered. And we also would have to look at things like targeted subsidies and price controls, things that generally economists and decision makers both to implement, but they will do it from time to time. And we have to convince them that food retail and access to food has to be part of that system. Of course, in the long term, the redesign stage, we're looking at things like covering certain basic foods under OHIP in order to integrate the food system with the healthcare system, and in some cases, complete neighborhood redesign around food. And there are different models of that across North America. And the other thing, of course, is that are we going to be food consumers or are we going to be food citizens? In other words, what is our capacity as individuals, in addition to these systemic changes, to have an impact on the system? And so, if you look at the typical food consumer model, people are primarily concerned with prices, safety, and nutrition. Whereas if you're a citizen, you bring additional values to the discussion and you buy, if you have the capacity, based on these additional values. And basically what this says is that if you're a citizen, you essentially are treating your dollar as a vote. You have larger public concerns and you understand that the food system itself should be progressively moving towards a more public rather than a strictly private regime, and that you can participate in that as a food citizen. Well, obviously, I've touched on a lot of material here. If you're really interested in more on this, my website, Food Policy for Canada, has a lot of details about how we transition the food retail and distribution system. And there's the URL right there at the bottom. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rod, for all of this information. just looking at the corporate concentration of retail food in Canada is incredible. Just seeing how it works and the implications it has for us, and it's been really enlightening to look at possible policy options to address it. So thank you very much. In the background, we have some illustrating going on, and I just want to make sure that we haven't sort of lost that. Jason, is there any way that you can show your screen? I'm not sure. Is that possible? Okay, I'm not sure. Maybe we'll figure this out. We'll figure this out in the background. We've got some prepared questions for, oh, there he is.
Hi. Okay,
Hi.
sorry about that. So here it is, and give me 2 seconds. Okay. So can you see that?
Wow.
Whew.
So that's a lot of material, and it was really, it was incredible to listen to. And I had no idea, actually, when I first started reading slides ahead of time, the staggering number, like the 12.7% or whatever that is for Canadian households, like I had no idea, like no idea at all about that. So this is where I love doing this sort of thing, because I'm all these unique sort of events that I get to go to. I'm learning so much, and it's a whole new sort of perspective on it. It's incredible.
Did you want to point out a few things in the illustration?
So we've got, like I said at the top left, 12.7% of Canadian households suffer from food insecurity. And then even as far as Dr. MacRae was saying there at the end, like the big sort of box stores monopolizing sort of food in general, and then the whole global rebellion on food source and stuff like that is just is really interesting to me as well. And even the 4 retail firms like control 70 to 80% of the food retailing is just mind-boggling. And even like you said, the shift recently in things, you know, one place buying up another place, and then sort of just creating these massive, almost like their own little industries is wild. So I think those are probably my biggest takeaways. And I will say the basic income and the study that was done with the I think it was the 4,000 Ontarians, and the experience they had with that, and the misconception that it's going to create like laziness, and their experience with that is also pretty incredible. So yeah, it was awesome to listen to.
This is amazing. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to turn to some prepared questions at this point. The first one is from Lauren Kennedy. And Lauren, if you're able to come on and ask your question, that would be great. Lauren is a registered dietitian with Peterborough Public Health, and she is the person at the center of coordinating the Food Access for Vulnerable Populations network in Peterborough, and a strong advocate for addressing food insecurity and using a basic income to do it. So, Lauren, are you?
Yeah, thanks so much.
There you are.
Yeah, thanks so much, both for your excellent presentations. Very thought-provoking and so many different angles. So one of the questions that's emerged also out of some of our food access calls through the Peterborough Food Action Network, when we think about reasons that food charity can be an appealing concept, We know that food charity brings people together with a perceived sense of purpose, compassion, connection. And sometimes there's also this sort of immediate impact and hope that is perceived with food charity. And so sometimes shifting the conversation towards distance can seem a little bit less tangible and more distant. So just wanted to see if you had thoughts about that. Are there ways that some of these systems change initiatives that we can bring some of that purpose, compassion, connection, impact, hope, that sense of that, and move those positive feelings from food charity into food systems? I apologize if that's a convoluted question.
Well, I have a few thoughts on it, which is that it's one of the reasons why I use a transition framework, and this first stage called the efficiency stage, which I should highlight is not the typical conception of efficiency. There's of course the language of efficiency has a particular meaning in our dominant economic system, and that's not the conception of efficiency that's being brought to bear in this transition framework. But the advantage of that first stage of transition is it's really building on things that are already familiar to us and things that a lot of people are already involved with. And because the time frame and the resources needed to implement are lower, we can see some tangible results from it relatively quickly. So that stage, I think, partly addresses what you're talking about. When we get into the substitution and the redesign stages, especially when we're looking at them from right now, they look more abstract and remote and more difficult to connect to emotionally. But the hope, of course, in a transition framework is that as you move progressively through the stages, then the next stage coming up doesn't look so distant as it did when you started out.
Thank you.
Great. Elaine, did you want to provide
Sure.
comments as well?
Yeah, I think thanks, Lauren, for your question. I think your observations are really spot on, you know, that the food charity really engages people in this very immediate action. And I think really I think there's something really primal about feeding and really satisfying about feeding a hungry person. You know, if you know that your action can directly impact someone who is hungry, there's something very satisfying about that. And so it's so immediate and so direct. And you're right that, you know, as we get into kind of more abstract thinking, sometimes we lose people. It gets harder to understand or to engage people because it feels very abstract. I think, you know, I mean, I'm looking at this from a different angle than Rod is. And from my perspective, I think people do kind of get that if, in terms of basic income, that's fairly simple. You know, if you need money to go to the grocery store or to the farmer's market or wherever else you're going to buy your groceries. So it's maybe, I'm talking at a different level than Rod is. I do think that what basic income would do, especially for people who live in poverty, is actually to give, and what we've seen with the pilots is that it gave people the opportunity to kind of step back and actually think about things a little differently. So I think in a way, basic income is necessary but insufficient for food system change. It would give people a chance to back up and think about things. And I think lots of people who live on low incomes, I mean, their only imperative is to get, cheap food that is filling. They would much rather be buying different food, and they appreciate local food as much as any of the rest of us. So I think basic income, as I say, is necessary but insufficient. So, and if the food banks dried up and blew away, then there's still lots of other things we could be doing with our energy if we wanted to have community meals or community gardens, or there could be lots of other things we could be doing around food that is not food charity. So I think there's lots of things, lots of ways to channel people's that emotional engagement.
Thank you. Yeah, I think both of those together are really helpful, um, and I also really like the efficiency substitution redesign framework that you mentioned, Rod, and I think that's helpful in this too. And thanks, Elaine, for mentioning those other ways that people can be actively engaged in food action. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren, for your question. I think we've got another one. We're going to move to Harriet. And Harriet's been asking some questions in the chat box, and we wanted to provide her with a bit of opportunity to ask these questions in person. So there you are.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for this panel, and especially to Elaine and Rod. And of course, my question has changed since the various ones I wrote in the chat box, partly because they've been answered a bit by Lauren. And I did look up the link to the Peterborough Bridges website, and that's beautiful. And it's very much, I think, what Elaine was saying in the last comment just now about what people can do that is better than charity. My question to Elaine, which I guess is still there, is, and then I have one for Rod now too. The question for Elaine is about emotions and about how to, you know, I don't know about pity and compassion. There is, I agree with almost everything you said. It's just that signing petitions doesn't seem enough. And I'm getting petition fatigue. I just sit at home as part of the lockdown class, you know, signing one petition after another. And of course, it's related to housing and the housing crisis, which takes us to land, which takes us also to the question, one of the questions I want to ask Rod, that, you know, we need a much broader framework of policy change to help people live decent and dignified lives and to thrive. You know, we really do. And I wonder even about the efficiency substitution redesign model, in the sense that we can do some things that could lead in the wrong direction, that can reinforce the directions we don't want to. And I can give some examples of that in the work I'm doing specifically around agriculture. But the question had to do with emotions, and how do we, instead of making distinctions, which is helpful in a way, how do we channel the kind of emotions where you want to help? I'm going to start crying because really when I pass people sleeping rough in this cold, you know, I just leave as much money as I can, and I feel better if they're not there, and I can just try to find a place where it won't get lost in their a little improvised outdoor home. And you know, I don't think that's anything. And I don't think it's also motivated by, you know, feeling by good karma or anything. It's really a frustration about not knowing what to do. And I think this building bridges kind of idea and community kitchens or whatever it could be, although it's so hard in the pandemic, which is a real issue here that's relevant to everything we're saying. And things, and even the statistics, corporate profits, Loblaws, and now what MacRae just announced, huge profits, and the subsidy to these frontline workers in the grocery stores has got rid of. And, you know, I mean, it's a scandal that the gap between rich and poor is getting worse. And the pandemic seems to be making it worse, and government policies, mainly the ones I've seen, although they help some people a little bit, are actually making it worse. And so how do we channel the emotions? How do we do work that will get us past just helping our neighbors? I mean, partly helping our neighbors can create a civil society connection that might lead us to better, especially when we can get together physically, lead us to better politics, you know, to try to get there. So that's one. And then to Rod, or do you want me to wait? Yeah, it's really the corporate concentration. Like, how do we, I love Marina's work. I do know it. In fact, I've read it pretty carefully, and I think it's brilliant. And one thing you kind of left out, I know you know it, is that the 15 minutes is to walk, to be able to walk.
Yes.
for 15 minutes. And of course, that has to do with transportation and housing and everything else as well. So, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't just try to have a market city. Absolutely, we should. It's that the market city, I'll take this as an example, is not the only one, but the market city and Marina's own practice through the Evergreen Farmers Market, through her individual heroic efforts when the farmers markets were closed for a while, and still to help farmers access local consumers, that has to be part of the picture, that the market city, and I guess I was asking too about the Ontario Food Terminal, that the public and civil society organizations somehow need to extend to regional food economies, so that we get beyond critique of the distance and redundant trade and all those things to how can we actually support farmers too, who do suffer economically and are themselves pretty heroic and right now very creative in doing things. And how do we do it in a way that doesn't increase the income disparity once again? Like I, as part of the lockdown class, can afford deliveries from the virtual farmers market. But even as food prices go up in the supermarkets, the gap between the prices that we have to pay to have those direct connections are high, much higher, you know? And not everyone can afford to do that, even if they want to. So those are big questions. Thank you. Thank you for trying in advance.
So thank you, Harriet, for your questions, and thank you for coming today. And I think, all of us feel that, that sense of, I'm finding myself kind of ranging between despair and fury. I'm just actually enraged at the state of things. These interviews that I've been doing with people across the country living in poverty, they have literally kept me awake at night. These are the most challenging interviews I've ever done, and some of it is doing them remotely or by phone, but just the outrage of expecting that anyone should have to live on or try to live on $700 a month anywhere in the country it's completely outrageous. It's state-inflicted violence. And so I think our compassion has to have a strong channel of rage and anger, actually. So sometimes I tell people, I don't know if you've ever seen the animated film, The Incredibles, but there's a little baby in The Incredibles that explodes into rage. That's his superpower. He bursts into flames.
All babies have that superpower, yes.
So I'm trying to channel my rage so that I don't just burn out, because I think rage can just burn us to the point where we fry, but to channel that into political action. I think we might need to take inspiration from the Black Lives Matter movement, the kind of the slogan, no justice, no peace, that without justice, that we should be in the streets marching, even in a pandemic. And I think that might be what it's going to take, actually, to push our politicians. There's all kinds of, we don't need any more evidence for basic income, for example. We don't need any more evidence about, the dangers of corporate concentration. When you have the Prime Minister giving buckets of our taxpayer dollars to food banks and then telling us to put items in the food bank bin, you know very well who they're supporting. And so it might take us all marching in the streets. But I think in a bigger picture, and what you've alluded to, is we need a different economic frame. We need a different way of valuing food, of valuing human life over corporate profits. And so I've also taken inspiration from Kate Rayworth's work on donut economics, this idea that we need to look after the human needs within the confines of the planet. And so this idea of the donut is the safe zone where we can meet, where everybody's needs can be met without overshooting the planetary limits. So As I say, we need a good dose of rage, I think, to get marching in the streets, because people really are they really are dying. They like. There's a woman I've been in touch with in one of these interviews who lives in northern Newfoundland, who's having her social assistance clawed back. So she has $33 this month to pay her bills. She has no heat in her house, and she has multiple health conditions. It's costing the healthcare system thousands of dollars because she's living in poverty, and she's going to die prematurely because of poverty. So it's unacceptable.
I wonder if we can put together the external costs of bad diet, which we all know about, right, to the healthcare system, for instance, in some of our policy frames, right? So I don't know how you convince the government and the lobbyists and all, how to put those things together, but somehow maybe we could.
We
Maybe.
have lots of evidence. We have lots of data. That doesn't seem to be
Data
enough.
doesn't do it. That's why I asked about emotions, right?
No, we also need to put pressure on the politicians. And I know from my own MP or MPP here in Kingston, the kind of, as much as we appreciate the work of Lead Now and other groups, they just dump all those those electronic petitions into a file folder. So actually handwriting letters gets attention because it shows that you've taken time. But we need to make it an election issue, and we need to push make it really clear that we're not going to vote for politicians unless they step up and actually put people before profits.
Thank you.
Well, quickly, a lot of my website is about, in a sense, bypassing the elected officials. And one of the things as advocates that we haven't done very well is really get better at understanding where decisions are made and who's making them, and then how we can influence that decision-making process. And it's a different kind of experience, obviously, or a different kind of skill set than the kinds of things that we can be good at, which is, sometimes it's marching in the street, sometimes it's petitions, sometimes it's meeting with elected officials. Well, a lot of decisions around the food system are actually being made subterraneanly. In other words, they're not obviously in the places where we think they are. So I spent some time on my website trying to help advocates understand what we need to do differently to affect change. So that's one big piece, and the corporate concentration piece. I think we won't make any progress on that until we actually strengthen the competition laws, and they used to be stronger. So we're not actually asking for something that hasn't already existed. And I've gone through on my website in certain sections of an actually proposed new language in the Competition Act, which, in terms of, the editing is not that significant. In terms of the impact, obviously it would be, and the resistance to it may be significant as well. But I think that, as has been highlighted, there's so much irrationality in the system, which is weighing everything down. And the weight of it is actually also resting on decision makers and whether elected or unelected. And a lot of them are now desperate for ways out of the morass we've created for ourselves. And so a lot of what I'm proposing is sort of, sort of kindler, gentler ways, if you will, of trying to make our way through this mess progressively so that it doesn't seem so onerous and daunting when we start down the trail.
Thank you, Rod. I always learn so much from you. And you do such hard work getting inside these policy processes.
Thank you.
Of government and all of it. Yeah.
You're muted, Marianne.
Sorry. Yes, the symbol of this year. Thank you, Harriet, for your question, and thanks, Elaine and Rod, for showing us some of the many ways that we can affect change. I'm not sure if we've got time for one more question. Do we think? Okay, there's one in the chat box here. I've lost it.
Mary, I've got it here.
Have you got it there?
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
So this is from Alyssa Overend. There's a bit of a sort of leading to the question, but so she says her question has to do with the ways in which food bank drives up, sort of promote the consumption and purchasing of kind of the cheapest, least sustainable, highest sort of preserved food. So she asks, do you think that the use of food banks purposefully upholds interests of corporate food interests?
I'm going to take a first stab at that, and I think it's a really interesting question. I think the people who started food banks back in the 1980s, the kind of people in the church basements who didn't want to see Canadians go hungry, certainly had no idea what they were doing. Well, I think they had no idea what the impact, the unintentional effects of what they were doing would be. And so I think what's happened is that the corporate sector has literally capitalized on our emotions to their own ends. It's kind of like other corporate philanthropy. So at the level of I think of the church lady handing out a bag of food to somebody, I don't think they're imagining that they're upholding the interests of corporate food corporations, but certainly at much higher levels at Food Banks Canada, there was a huge shift in the early 2000s where we saw, it looks like a lot of coordination between Canada and the US and globally, the global food banking network. Everything got very shiny all at the same time, a lot of corporate messaging. And so at a higher level, absolutely food banks are upholding corporate interests at that level, the Food Banks Canada level. And so it's actually devilishly clever. It's kind of malicious, but I think at the lower level, it's unintentional. It's unintentional, and I don't mean to malign the good-hearted efforts of anyone donating or volunteering, but there are profound unintentional consequences of that, and that's really hard for people to grasp, I think. So thank you, Alyssa, for the question.
If I could just add to that, I think there are two particular ways in which this kind of relationship helps sustain each grouping. One is, and I always think of this as, one of the more irrational parts of this process is the idea that we go into a store, buy more of that store's goods, and then put it in a donation box on the way out the door. What it's really doing, of course, is propping up sales for that particular store. It makes, much more sense to just be donating money directly if one wants to donate money directly to the food bank so that it can do whatever it wants to do rather than going through the grocery store itself, especially because we know that food banks often are short on certain critical things. We know that the food bank diet, as Elaine has highlighted, is generally inadequate. So if they have more flexibility, that might be a good thing. Is if they're existing and they're going to continue to provide certain kinds of services, it makes sense that they make those services as good as possible. But the larger way in which this relationship is a bit insidious is around waste, food waste. So we know that roughly half of the food that gets produced on a farm never makes it to somebody's mouth, which is an astonishingly corrupt kind of statistic. It just shows how ludicrous the whole system is, how badly designed it is that we can waste half the food that's generated on a farm, and somehow that's okay. And there are multiple reasons why that happens, and there are multiple sort of relief valves, if you will, for the corporate world around this. But one of them is the food banks. in that, of course, if you produce a food that, if you get the labeling wrong, the packaging wrong, if it's not moving and the expiry date is coming close, rather than have to dispose of it in some way or make use of it in some effective way, it's simpler to give it to the food bank. So the food banks, unfortunately, are somewhat complicit in the food waste problem. They won't be, getting rid of them won't in itself solve the food waste problem. There are multiple things that have to be done, and I highlight a lot of them on my website, but it's definitely a piece of the story.
Great, thank you so much. I think that we're about out of time. It's too bad that we couldn't have more time to continue this discussion, but you've given us a lot of food for thought and really helped us to rethink the donation box and what that means. So thank you to everybody who could attend. And I don't know, Jason, if you want to put up your images one more time before we say goodbye.
Yeah, it's come your way.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
Wow.
That's great.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Amazing.
That's incredible. Yeah. There's so much.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
That's great. That's great.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care.